All right, I think we can begin, and then if anybody is running a little late, I will let them in. Again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to introduce the topic of the strategy of privacy with not two, but three guests. We actually had a surprise person join us last minute, but that is all right. I will let everybody introduce themselves first, and let's start with you, Professor Black.
We'd like to thank Texas Tech University, Costa Rica for hosting this second installment of the Cybercrimes webinars. I'm joined tonight by my colleagues Mark Voorhees and Dan Wilkins, and we have something special, I think, tonight. So to get us started, in 1890, a 35-year-old lawyer named Louis Brandeis and his law partner Sam Warren published an article entitled "The Right to Privacy" in the Harvard Law Review. In that article, they wrote, quote, "Recent inventions and business methods call attention to the next step, which must be taken for the protection of the person and for securing the right to be let alone," end quote. Mr. Brandeis and Mr. Warren were referring, of course, to the invention of the portable camera and to newspapers that were publishing what they called society gossip columns. Today, we would call those paparazzi. This evening, we're going to talk about privacy and data regulation and what that means for your organizations when we do business online and everyone has multiple social media accounts and governments everywhere are regulating data and the collection of data. So we're going to break this into three parts, told by Mark Voorhees, Dan Wilkins, and myself. And we'll turn it over to Mark Voorhees.
Thanks, Steve. My name is Mark Voorhees. I've actually been working in the private sector, but I've known Steve for 7 or 8 years and worked on a bundle of projects with him, and Dan for a couple of years working on also several projects, and spend a lot of time on the cybersecurity world. I have three brief stories that I'd like to tell about cybersecurity and why privacy is important. The first is, you'll notice at the bottom of the stadium, we're big in the United States of sports fans as you are. One of my first years in the cybersecurity business 4 or 5 years ago, on two back-to-back Friday night weekends, I had two clients that had two separate breaches. The clients were actually very, very similar. One was a public university that had about 11,000 students. One was a community college that was about 12 or 14 miles away from that university that had about 9,000 students. But realistically, they were very similar in size and lived in the same community. And the first community college, their website was actually hacked, and they were unable to register students for about 3 days. And so we came in and performed the forensics for them and did the cost audits and what that cost them. And when it came down to a dollar figure, that actually didn't cost them very much, just a little bit of inconvenience and having to scramble to get all of the students to register for that 3-day period. The following weekend, the same, like I said, size university, not too far away, had their alumni database hacked and their privacy shown to the public of who was in that alumni database and who had donated over the last 10 years. And they consistently raised in the 8-figure number in US dollars for that alumni database every year in donations to the university. And those numbers dropped the first year by 70%. So it cost them in the range of $8 to $10 million that first year. In the second year, it cost them about 50%, and they never recovered so far in the last 5 years over 40% of that number. So they're going on close to $30 million that breach cost them. And it cost them that much money specifically because the privacy of those donors, and there was a large list in their alumni database, those donors had had their information exposed and didn't appreciate having that information exposed. So sometimes the cost of privacy can be much more than the cost of having some of the more what we consider linear cybersecurity challenges. On the right, you'll see there a Formula One race car broken out into all of its components. I actually worked for a client my first week at one of the cybersecurity firms that I worked for. We went and did a forensics audit of a customer that made machine parts, very specific machine parts for, in this case, they were working on the F-35 project, one of the new military planes in the United States. The military plane has 1.3 million parts approximately, and obviously showing that in a slide is very difficult, but you get the idea from the Formula One example. And their job was to machine very specific parts for this for this plane. And as they were machining these parts, and we did this forensics audit, we could tell that they'd been in business a number of years. I want to say 26 or 27 years, and they took schematics from different kinds of projects like this, and with their four-dimensional machining, they would build projects for them. We were able to track that every one of those blueprints over that 26 years had already been stolen by a foreign government. And we told them specifically, and you can imagine the look on their face when we said that every project you've ever worked on has already been stolen. We might as well wrap this up and start over from a security perspective. And hopefully we can protect some of the things that will happen to you in the future. And the fact that we were able to do that and keep it private, except for them and the clients that they dealt with, and it never made it into the public, potentially saved their business, even though they had a significant breach, and we're able to help them with that breach going forward. The third example, you'll all seen this picture of the Evergreen, which caused almost 8 days of traffic jam in the Suez Canal. There's all sorts of interesting behind the scenes issues going on in the background of what actually caused that traffic jam. Of course, the press has said that it acted like a big wind sail and that it was the captain's fault and all of these kinds of things. But in the cyber world, there's lots of scuttle going around saying that that was actually a cyber breach, that they'd had some of their port systems hacked, and that was done specifically. There's a lot of reasons behind the scenes of why that's happened. But you see that picture there that says Evergreen on it. And that picture from a privacy perspective is something that corporation will never be able to avoid, because their privacy has already been shown to the public and it's been eliminated. And the costs of that specific ship, which is, I want to say, the length of about 3 football fields and one of the top 20 largest carrier ships in the world, the company that actually owns that ship that is now stuck in Egypt, waiting on the legal battle over what the proceeds will be, may never recover from something that big. And if we find out later that it was a cybersecurity breach, because of the breach, and it was able to go public instead of private, the costs are significantly more. Very interesting in the privacy world. Steve, I'm going to throw it back over to you.
All right.
Now, if you look at this, if you look at this group of folks, yeah, thanks, Steve. If you look at this group of folks, all of them or most of them are companies that you'll see and understand. And every person on this list that we know of has had a breach of some kind or another. Now, some of them have not been highly publicized. Some of them have been extremely highly publicized. But the clients, the time that it takes for those clients to be able to continue working or for them to solve those legal issues that they have because of the privacy that's been exposed is significant. They estimate in a report that I just saw last week that there'll be a breach of some kind forecast in 2021 every 13 seconds for a different kind of corporation around the world. And those costs will escalate to be worth more than $20 billion, they estimate this year. Big pennies involved. Sorry, Steve.
No, that's okay. If you haven't read the chat, we wanted to let you know if you have questions, we are happy to be interrupted, and you can put your questions in the chat. We'll try and monitor those as we're going along. Obviously, we get excited about these stories, but interrupt us and ask your questions. So with that, Dan, you're up.
All right, thanks, Steve. So let's talk about security culture a little bit. If you look back in history, you look back over several generations, security was more of a physical thing. Security was the guard shack, the guy standing at the door with a gun. It was maybe some cameras from the perimeter. And some of this was based on just the environment that people were in and where they came from and how they grew up and those kinds of things. But as we start to move forward and start to look at what this culture means for individuals, especially in the rising generations, they're all based on a foundation of values. There's some amount of value that goes into the security culture, and that could be what you learned from your parents or your grandparents. That could be what you learned in school when you were going through different experiences in school. It could be a variety of different things, but all these things kind of add to your values. It's like, what do you value as security? What is important to you? What is important to you as an individual, as a family man, as a family person? So that's what kind of starts this whole process. And that molds and shapes your attitude. So what is your attitude towards security? How much investment do you have in security? Where does this lead you from a security culture perspective? So now you see this start to form your attitude a little bit as far as, well, I want to spend some more time on this. I want to focus on this a little bit better. I see all these stories in the news, all these breaches of data, and my data is out there as well. So I want to make sure that my data is protected. Now you start to have a personal opinion. You start to have an attitude about this, and not an attitude as a bad attitude, but an attitude of, I want to do the right thing. I want companies to do the right thing with my data and my information. And then that leads us to the patterns. Now we look at patterns of succession, patterns of people working, how things operate, the functionality, things like that. And the pattern of security is, as part of this culture, is some of the decisions you make, some of the different things that you're going to come across, and some of the things like password reuse. So if you're reusing passwords on multiple accounts because it's easy to remember, that's going to be part of your security culture. How secure is your environment? Well, if that one password gets broken, how many cascading effects is that going to have? And this leads us into a cycle of improvement. So now we know that we have some problems, we need to improve this. And what does that look like? So if you're looking at this from a maturity standpoint, you start building on these foundations, you start getting into the cycle of improvement, and then you have some type of a metric where you're going to get a report of information, and maybe you'll have a breach report, maybe you'll have a report of different credentials that were compromised in some site that the attackers went after, like a social media site or something like that. And after all this comes together, you look at all this and it all comes together, then it becomes embedded as a culture. So now you might say, not going to happen to me. I'm going to put the credit freezes on my accounts. I'm going to make sure that all my passwords are unique and strong. And this starts to become a embedded culture. Now, if you look at the maturity from a growth standpoint, which is what this chart is here, this chart takes you from the very, very bottom here in red. It says, this is my foundation. This is my initial security culture. And when you're starting, you don't have any yet. You haven't really started with any foundation yet. But as you start adding your values and your attitudes and your patterns in, now you've got a program. And that program is going to be something repeatable. And that repeatable element of the program is going to help you maybe meet an audit requirement. It's going to maybe help you, prevent people from clicking on phishing emails or whatever. So you're going to have some type of a repeatable process in place. Now, this process in place is going to lead you to want to grow and be better and define behavior change in the environment, whether that's making sure that all my accounts are unique and passwords are unique and strong and all that. That's a behavior change. That's coming from a culture of we grew through a lot of different problems and now we've learned from them and we're going to try to do better. And this is where you have that defined process in place. This is where your culture is going to really start taking effect in a company, in an organization, or an individual. Now, the problem is, this is where a lot of companies and organizations stop. They get to this point and they just don't really progress much farther past this because it takes a lot of effort to change behavior. People have done things the same way all their lives, or that's how they learned it. People don't want to change. So this is where the brakes kind of slow everything down, and it kind of hangs out here for a long time. But what we want to do is we want to get people and organizations and groups and the thought process to move along this maturity path to get to the managed stage where you're actually having support by leadership, you're having buy-in, you're having a security program in place that is going to be meaningful. It's going to generate metrics for the company that start showing value. It says, okay, we've got less breaches, we've got less exposure, we've got less problems. And that is going to take you to the final stage of optimization. And the optimization is where we see that return on investment. We see all of our security training, we see all of the things that we put into place, all of our controls that we purchased, all of the configurations that we've done for our firewalls and everything like that. We're going to measure that return on investment now. So this is where we want to get everybody to, but right now, a lot of organizations are stuck down here in the stage 2 and stage 3. Go ahead, next slide, Steve.
All right, and Mark, do you have your hand up? Are we?
No, not me.
Okay.
I'm glad somebody's watching that because I can't see it on my screen here. So good catch there. All right, so now we've built past the culture, and now we have to say, what does this culture mean from a privacy perspective? What is privacy, and how do culture and privacy come together? Well, before you cross that bridge, before you go down that trail, you have to understand that you need data classification. Now, classification can go in a lot of directions here. You can get really granular, detailed. But what we have to do is simplify it to make it easy to remember and easy to exercise and implement. And how we do that is we break it down into 4 easy pieces. These 4 easy pieces: public data. What is public data? Well, that doesn't really cause a lot of damage if it gets out. That means maybe somebody's name and title, the place where they work, just very basic company information, nothing that's going to be damaging if it was, blowing down the street and somebody picked it up and looked at it, not really a big deal. Well, then we migrate on and we get to internal use. Now our risk starts to go up a little bit. We see a little bit of slight risk. We see maybe some sales numbers, maybe some competitive advantage here, inventory systems, inventory of equipment and software and personnel and things like that. We may see marketing data that's specific to our organization. And then we can see profit and loss statements and things that maybe we just don't want to get out. But if they did get out, not the end of the world. I mean, our company is probably going to go on. It's probably going to be, a little bit of a sting, but not terrible. Okay. And then we migrate to confidential. Now, confidential is now where you start to get potential harm coming. We've got sensitive information. We've got things that we don't want out because it's damaging to either a person or a business. This is going to be your social security numbers, your health record information, maybe your CJIS, which is criminal justice information system, your PII, PHIs, things like that. Oh, sorry, somebody cut through. Oh.
I think we're
just
good.
a little bit of blue over. And this is where your education records and those things. So we don't want that confidential data out. This is where that harm starts happening. This is harm for people and organizations. And this is where we start to see the damages occurring. And then finally, we get down to the restricted classification. And this is where we see our proprietary information, our secret formulas, our legal documents, our court records, our research that we've done, maybe trade secrets, bank account information, credit card information. This is where the damage really happens, is down at this restricted level here. Now that we know the classifications, we know how to protect the data and how to protect privacy. So go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. All right, so let me paint a picture for you here. I'm going to paint a scenario here. This scenario, we've got several healthcare industries that had an employee take a laptop with a database home, leave it in their car. The laptop got stolen and all these records were exposed. We've got attackers that were able to come into an environment with a phishing email and compromise and do spear phishing and compromise information directly through a health organization. We've got students in various schools across the world that have had their information exposed. And if we start to look at the trends here, start to look at what this means. Now I'm putting together this big picture of just different scenarios here. We have employees in a company, their information is exposed. And then we have the general citizens, where citizens, through their bill paying or library service or whatever they're doing, normal business, their information is exposed. But one thing in common across all these people is they had an expectation of privacy. The culture was, I expect my data to be protected. I expect when I give it to somebody that it's protected. And so now we look at the statistics, we look at the trends. And last year, 2020, 43% of all data breaches in the world were healthcare industry related. So 43%. Now you look at that from a number, and you look at the millions and billions of transactions and things that are happening. Half of those, almost half, 43%, were breaches of healthcare industry. Now, healthcare's got a lot of information. It's got disease information, health conditions. It's got insurance information, private information. It's got a lot of information that's very, very valuable. We look at the schools just in the United States, not talking worldwide, just in the United States. 24 million records were leaked out of 1,300 breaches. Now, these are student files. These are your FERPA records. These are stuff that you had no expectation that was going to be leaked, and it got compromised through various methods and various ways, and some of it's attacker-based and some of it's negligence, but these records are breached. Then we look at government side of things. Calgary in Canada. The city of Calgary was sued for $93 million because a staff member emailed a whole bunch of information to another municipality someplace else, And that email contained a whole bunch of information about workers' comp information and board claims and medical records and just a whole bunch of information that should not have been emailed. So the city got sued for $93 million because this was a breach of information that should not have happened. And then we close this out with March of 2020. The Census Bureau had an unprotected database that held 800 gigabytes of information. Now I'm talking personal information that was a breach of 200 million user accounts of information. Now, if you're the person that's got your information stored, you're like, hold on here, I didn't have any part of this. Why is my information now part of this? And now it's all compromised because you weren't protecting it. So now we've got this expectation of privacy here. So benefit providers, they have to collect this positive identification to be able to provide benefits. They have to say it's you, and not just because you told me your name. I have to verify that it's you. So now I've got a collection of your information. Businesses may want to collect customer feedback, but they want to say, who was giving me this feedback? Is it a 9-year-old on a computer, or is it a adult that's giving me services? So they need to understand who they're dealing with. So they collect some information to be able to do that. Sometimes it's credit card information, just to say, I just need a valid credit card just so I know that you're an adult or somebody that's got the ability to give me the information I'm looking for. Or sometimes it's a paid survey. Maybe the paid survey says, in order to pay you, in order to give you money for this survey, I need to know your address and your bank account or credit card or whatever information you're going to let me pay you with. I need to know that. So now I'm going to get a copy of that. So you have to ask yourself, what data is being collected and what is its purpose? So why are you collecting the data to begin with, and what is its purpose? So looking at privacy, if I'm collecting a social security number or bank account number or address and all the details, that may be fine for what I'm doing, but how long do I need to hold that information? Do I need to just verify it? Okay, I've checked the box now, I know who it is, and I can close it out and I don't need it, I can delete the data, or am I holding on to it for convenience? But now you can see that this will run into cascading effects. So we look at some of the things like maybe you're subject to public information requests and things like that, where you can't just delete stuff because you don't feel like holding onto it any longer. You may have a requirement to hold onto it for all of your transactions for your organization. So you may have a records retention law that you have to deal with. And those are the kinds of things that you have to think about when you're talking about, I need to protect the data and what's this mean from a privacy perspective. So as a custodian of that data, you may not be able to delete that just because you want to. You may have to do retention because of a legal requirement. Now, here's where it gets really sticky. What if you're collecting non-sensitive information, just like a name and address and something that maybe by itself is not PII, but what if a citizen or student or healthcare worker or whatever, what if they accidentally, instead of their address, paste their bank account information in or their social security number and hit submit? That information comes to you now. So now you're not, you didn't ask for the data, but you have a copy of it now. You're holding a copy of this person's personal or sensitive or private information, whether that's they attached the wrong document and they attached their medical bill or their bank statement or whatever. Now you have responsibility because you now own a piece of that data, even though it was an accident and you didn't want to have it, you didn't ask for it, but you have it now. So you have a responsibility to protect this data now. And so these are the things that people don't really understand. From a privacy perspective, you may get information that is private that you now are responsible to protect, and you weren't aware of. Which brings us down to our retention and everything like that. What is the length of time that this data is needed? If you need to verify social security number or bank account or credit card or something like that for the data, how long do you need to hold that information? Is it 10 seconds? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? I mean, what length of time are you authorized and required to hold that information? And these are the things that's going to lead you to the answers that you need to classify the data properly and protect the data from a privacy perspective. I think that is on to you, Steve. Next slide.
Okay, sounds good. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I'm going to remind you again that if you want to interrupt us, please put something in the chat. We'd be happy to stop and answer your question. If not, we're happy to stick around afterwards and talk some more. If I don't hear any, then we're off to part 3 of our presentation, which should start with a story. And let's not do any story. Let's just do a love story, because that makes us all feel happy and good. What do you say? Kind of. So this is a story starting with Rosie and her boyfriend, Houston, who were waiting for a flight from New York to Dallas. And as they boarded the flight, they noticed that they weren't sitting together. They hadn't been assigned seats together. And so they decided to ask the young woman who was sitting next to Houston, the boyfriend, if she would move. Her name was Helen, and she happily agreed. So they joked with her. They said, well, maybe this is a good thing for you, because maybe you will meet the love of your life. So Helen got up and took the seat that was assigned to Rosie, which happened to be 16C, the seat right in front of them. And that should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because Helen's new seatmate, Ewan, was a model and good looking, which was perfect because Helen was a fitness instructor and good looking. And wow, now this is getting exciting. And it turned out that Ewan was a fitness instructor too, like a match made in heaven. So Helen and Ewan started talking and talking and talking, and they did not stop for nearly the entire 4-hour flight. And, you know, they started off with small talk, and then they started talking about Ewan's mom, which Helen found to be really hot. And then they started talking about their thoughts about marriage and about children and why they were both single. They shared the armrest. Their arms occasionally touched. At one point, it even looked like Helen was resting her head on Ewan's shoulder. And, you know, cute love story of all cute love stories. This is amazing. And at this point, you may be wondering how I, who was not aboard Alaskan Airlines Flight 3327 in June of 2018, would know about this at all. Except that I told you that they were sitting directly in front of Rosie and her boyfriend, Houston, who happened to watch and listen and record this entire conversation and document it with, you know, pictures and video and words and eventually a series of tweets, because our lives do not exist unless we tweet every moment of it, right? Sounds good. So instead of just sitting back and watching the in-flight movie or taking a nap or reading or doing anything else, they did this and this. So Helen and Ewan went from being strangers on a plane to participants in what we could call a very epic plane ride between New York and Dallas. And Rosie then, after they got home, decided that this story needed to be told. So she started. Last night on a flight home, she wrote, my boyfriend and I asked a woman to switch seats with me so we could sit together. We made a joke that maybe her new seat partner would be the love of her life. And well, now I present you with this thread. And, you know, as stories go, it's a cute one, except sometimes when we put stories on the internet, the story itself becomes the story and grows and grows. And Rosie decided that this needed tweet after tweet after tweet. And she recreated the story as if it was happening in real time. And as she tweeted, the story became a thing. And suddenly she found herself with 300,000 followers and 1 million likes. And for me, whose Twitter account probably has 2 followers, and that would be my mom and, you know, maybe Dan and Mark, right? I wouldn't know if those are big numbers or not. But those small endorsements brought more attention until it appeared on the morning news and it appeared on blogs, and people started filming themselves reading this story. and reacting to the latest of Rosie's developments. And they began to wonder what was going to happen to this young woman and this young man who had just met on the plane. So they started adding their own insights and developing the characters. And pretty soon, the young man who was just sitting there had his own hashtag, Plane Bay or Plane Hunk, which I don't know which one's better, but you know, great. It is true, we are social creatures and we are nosy creatures. And we love to hear and to tell stories about each other. And in the case of Helen and Ewan, audiences were rewarded for their investment because the story just, you know, seemed to go on. And especially in these troubling times, it had what everyone thought was a happy ending. How cute is that? So this is Rosie's picture of the two of them having just met on a plane 4 hours earlier, walking off into the sunset with their hard shell suitcases. And oh, right, isn't that just sweet? It makes your heart just go, you know, pitter patter. And the whole thing might have ended right there, except it didn't. As viewers got interested in this, then Ewan, it turns out, is actually the brother of Stu Holden, who is a former United States soccer player and current World Cup commentator. And wow, so now we've got, you know, minor, major celebrity, and he started to use the hashtag Plane Bay in all of his tweets. And, you know, Rosie, who had originally taken these photos, invited all of her followers to start tweeting with her. And she suggested that maybe they all should write a screenplay together. And it, you know, it seemed to be a great thing until Rosie asked her followers, we need to go find Helen because it doesn't seem like she is participating. Until Helen decided to speak up. And here is Helen's response through her lawyer. Without my knowledge or consent, other passengers photographed me. My personal information has been widely distributed online. Strangers have discussed my private life. I have been doxxed, shamed, insulted, harassed. People have come looking for me. This is not a romance. It is a cautionary tale about privacy and identity and ethics and consent. And she asked everybody to leave her alone, which almost brings us back to the point that we started in 1890 with two lawyers in Boston who said that maybe there needs to be a right to be left alone. So what do we learn about this? I don't know. So here's some things that we thought you may like from the Plane Bay story. And starting over here on the left, right? If somebody hands you the keys to a very fast car, it doesn't mean that the car belongs to you. And as organizations and businesses and people, occasionally people give us their parts of their personal life, their data, their national ID numbers, their credit card information, their trust. And as organizations, we need to remember that even though we may have the keys, the underlying data is not ours. And we see that over and over as countries and jurisdictions around the world begin to develop data regulation schemes. They keep reminding us that the data is not yours, which is a fascinating legal question. We can go on for hours and hours about how it's not yours, but I'm going to just remind us that the data is not ours. Moving to the center photo here, we need to remember that we should not be data stalkers. And as Dan so correctly pointed out, we need to really take a look at, number one, what data we do have in our possession and how much of that we actually need. We shouldn't be data hoarders, because as we mentioned last week, that can make us a target for hackers, but it can also leave us with a whole bunch of data that we do not need to be holding in our hands. And the third lesson that I thought we may want to take from all of this is that sometimes when somebody hands you the keys to a very fast car, that it can get away from us, and very quickly something bad can happen. When you take data that belongs to somebody else and you start to do things with it, as Mark pointed out, what your customers and clients and users and visitors want from you is to be able to trust you. And that trust goes to the center of your brand and your identity. And when things happen very quickly, as they do in the cyber world, and there is an incident, everything can be destroyed in an instant. So here are the three lessons that we thought we may want to take away from Plane Bay, which is number one, your data doesn't belong to you, or the data that you collect doesn't necessarily belong to you. And number two, that you shouldn't be a data stalker. You don't need to know everything about your customers. And if you do, then you have a much higher level of culpability or responsibility. And number three, just remember that incidents with data, just like the Plane Bay story, can get out of hand really quickly. And once they're out, and there's no way to control it at that point. Okay, Mark, Dan, any comments about that?
I think that in this world that we live in, when you talk about privacy, we're moving to a world where there is no such thing as privacy. And to protect that value of privacy is something that has to happen, as Dan presented, cognitively. It has to be something that we can continue to work towards, that becomes part of our DNA. Otherwise, because the monetary value of exposing that privacy is so great, there will be no privacy in the future. And especially when you deal with organizations like universities, as an example, in my example where they had significant databases of tens of thousands of students per year over many, many, many years, protecting those databases and those people's information does become a top priority. And it has to be something that we do on a constant, consistent, regular basis. And then we need to take that not only from our personal or from our private lives, but we need to begin to understand how to implement that in our personal lives, not just for ourselves, but also for our families. So we can continue to protect those things which are most important to us and save us a whole lot of time, energy, and headache in the future.
Yeah, great comments, Mark. I'll add to that we can't take the approach of it's somebody else's problem, not mine. We cannot take that approach. Everybody has to be conscious and aware of it. Everybody has to take ownership of it. And if it's not your data, it's somebody's data. You'd want somebody looking after you if you had your data deposited someplace and making sure it was protected. So we need to return the favor and do the same thing. So security is everybody's responsibility, and privacy is everybody's responsibility. So if you see an activity happening or an action happening that is not secure, speak up. Say, hey, I don't think you should be leaving that file on your desk open like that. I think you should lock it up. Or I don't think you should walk away from your computer with it unlocked. I mean, just small things make a big difference. And when you add them all up, it makes a huge difference for protecting everybody's data.
And I love these comments. I think we entitled this presentation "The Strategy of Privacy." I think what happens a lot of times, especially in today's regulatory environment, we track new bills and new legislative movements throughout the world as it regards privacy and data. And I'm going to tell you, I've got some really top-notch research assistants, but it keeps us busy because nearly everyone around the world is looking at these events thinking that we really need to protect people. That idea that it didn't start in 1890. That's one of the things that I think that we mentioned earlier, that security started with physical security, and that's been something that has been with us forever and ever. But as governments start to listen to their citizens and say, hey, organizations are not being as careful as we would like them to be, whether they are or not, once you get a regulation in place, we have to comply. And the problem is that we're getting a lot of those. So if you're part of a multinational organization and you are controlling or gathering or processing data anywhere in the world, it becomes a really big deal to achieve compliance, because you're looking at, number one, where does that data exist? And I can tell you that's just an interesting and completely baffling legal question. You know, we could go back to Mark's picture with the sports stadium, and sometimes I get asked that question by taxing authorities of, you know, where did the game happen? Because you've got two teams from different jurisdictions. Well, if you're collecting data from customers throughout the world, I can tell you that that data may exist in a lot of places around the world, which means that you've got to do a lot of compliance measures to make sure that you're compliant with every place around the world. And that gets nasty, especially when, you know, at least, you know, domestically here in the United States, I'm tracking a lot of different bills right now, because Florida and New York are both vying to be the next player out of the market, and Virginia's not far behind them. And that just means that we're going to have a whole bunch of data regulations. And the other day I got, you know, asked the question, let's assume that somebody from state number one travels to state number two for a sporting event, and while in state number two gives out credit card information or does something with a hotel or whatnot. Is that data in state number one or in state number two, or perhaps both or neither? And the person who had asked me was a litigator, because they said, we don't want our organization to be sued in a whole bunch of jurisdictions. So given all of that, frequently we meet with corporate executives who say, we just can't handle much more regulation. What are we going to do with this? And frequently what we do is say, you need to look at this not necessarily as a regulation like you have to do this, but as something that you want to do as a strategy measure. And that goes back to what Mark was saying, that if you've got a brand on your shipping containers, or you have a brand on your sports stadium, or you have, you know, a brand on your race car or your plane, you want to protect that brand. And part of that brand goes hand in hand with the data that you keep safe and secure for your customers and clients. Your clients want to trust you. That's why they're giving you that. I mean, not many of us go around and say, hey, I've got some personal information, you know, please take it from me. But as a strategy matter, we want to trust people. So that's part of what we're looking at. All right, one more slide, two more slides I think we have, and then we'll take some more questions. So here's the summary of the three parts that we've been talking about, or at least what I heard, and Mark and Dan are going to chirp in and tell me where I get wrong here. Your brand depends on your customers' trust, as we just mentioned. Your privacy culture is mission critical. If your culture is not thinking about, Dan and I were talking this week, there he is, or maybe it was last week, there's a wonderful photo of a castle somewhere in Europe, and I'm going to botch which country it comes from, but it's a big, thick, like, 16 inches thick wood door, and huge, like giants have to open this door because it's so massive. And then off to the side of the door is a smaller door that we use on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes I think we think of our, our privacy cultures, we got this really big door, but don't tell anyone about the side door that we use all the time. We need to think about privacy as a mission critical focus. And then the third thing is that data is valuable and it doesn't necessarily belong to you. So if you're thinking about these types of questions, we had a couple of suggestions for you. If your organization does not know, and this is a question that we sometimes ask executives and founders and managers and others, where is the data that you're collecting? And if we get a blank stare back, we smile. We understand that because a lot of organizations have not been tracking where their data, but you should consider a data audit to tell you where the data is and who's collecting it. Sometimes organizations are surprised when they find out that their employees or their volunteers are collecting more data than they thought they were collecting. As Dan mentioned, right? Sometimes I get accidental data, or sometimes, right, if I'm a hospitality company, sometimes my reservation agents start talking with customers and jotting things down. Well, now that's my data. I have collected it. So we need to know where the data is. Second thing is, if I have partners or vendors or anyone really who can access the data, whether I intend that access to happen or the access has happened, you should consider having a data flow analysis or a third-party assessment analysis done so that you know where the data can go and where it has gone. That kind of goes with the data audit. And then the third thing that we always say is at least once per year, all of the employees and all the volunteers should recertify. And that is two-part. Number one, they should recertify in data and privacy security awareness. So that is, do I know enough to know that this is valuable data and where it's going and how I'm taking care of it? And then also to participate in a data loss simulation. And the three of us have fun with these types of things. So, it sounds intimidating and we run it like war games because it's a serious process, but the simulations give us a chance with no risk of somebody's data leaving the building to simulate somebody's data leaving the building, whether that is the stolen laptop or the employee who walks in holding a clipboard and pretends to be an employee and walks out with all of our medical records, or any number of other simulations that actually the three of us have a lot of fun concocting to put your organization to the test and say, now, if this were to happen, what would you do? All right, anything else that we needed to mention on this slide? Questions at this point? Comments, thoughts?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay. Then if we're thinking about these things, hold on, let me just saw something come up in the chat and I'll get it when I hit the next slide here. I'll put this up and
I can say it for you if you want.
yes, please.
Awesome. So the question is from Adrian Peña. He asks, what are interesting examples of examples not to follow in regards to security policies and data protection that are little or barely known to the public?
That's a wonderful question. Anybody want to take the lead on that one?
I'll start us off. This can go a lot of directions here, but I'm trying to put some boundaries around it here real quick. So from the example not to follow is one, to not do anything, just to put your head in the sand and just to say, you know what, but I said it before, somebody else's problem, not my problem. But if you were trying to put some policy and some data protection and some security elements around it, you would really want to start with some frameworks. You want to start with that data classification that we talked about, make sure that you understand what type of data it is. And maybe that requires that you put specific controls around that. When you have certain types of information, a lot of times there's mandates or regulations that dictate what you have to do. And so just not knowing about the regulations, not knowing about those laws, not knowing about those requirements is definitely something not to do. I mean, you have to understand what's going on. And this is where many times a privacy officer will come into play because they understand the compliance, they understand the regulations, they understand the laws, they understand all of the different frameworks and the pieces behind that. So by not recognizing that you need somebody to focus on this effort is definitely something that you do not want to do.
And let me follow up with that with two examples. And like Dan, I'll follow the example of let me not disclose anything that shouldn't be disclosed. The first one was an organization that had gone through the process of developing security policies and they had an incident response plan. And when it came time to test that plan, everyone remembered that they had developed the plan and nobody could remember where they put the plan. So an incident response plan is supposed to be, hey, this is what we're going to do first, and this is who's going to do it. And, it's the emergency plan. And no one could remember where they had put the emergency plan, which wasn't doing them any good at the time. So the first thing I would say is, if you're going to go through the work of developing policies and plans, make sure you practice them so that they are not just a binder sitting on somebody's shelf in some office somewhere. The
Steve,
second one, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I'd add to that in the cybersecurity world, there's in the US about 3 million jobs open and less than 1 million people to fill them. So the average person only lives in their cybersecurity role, whatever that happens to be, for approximately 14 months, which means we spend way too much time with the information of what happens in cybersecurity organizations with that information kept in a very few people's heads, who tend to change pieces of their organization or move from organization to organization. And that IP, that important information, which is logged in heads instead of folders like you're talking about, moves very quickly across organizations. So you need to be cognizant of the fact that just because you know something doesn't mean your organization knows that. And the information that you have needs to be kept in a place in an organization where your predecessor or the next person in line can easily access that information, so it doesn't have to be relearned.
And that's great. And that'll set up my second point that I was going to mention. Different organization, in addition to having security policies, they were also dealing with research and trade secrets. And so they had non-disclosure agreements. And the problem was that nobody had reviewed the security policies, the plan, and the non-disclosure agreements because they conflicted. And the non-disclosure agreement said you can't share this with the people that you need to share it with. And so when I was not there if there was a breach, but if you've got conflicting information, then that can stop your employees, that can stop your managers, that can stop your first responders from being able to do what they need to do. And some of these non-disclosure agreements are written without security in mind. And they're perfectly fine non-disclosure agreements, except they tend to be very draconian and very inflexible. And you need those policies to work for your organization, not against your organization. Okay, I don't know if we answered that question or if there was something more that we needed to address there. Anytime. All right. So we have put together a list, if your organization is thinking about these types of things, of some other types of things you ought to look at as you're expanding past basic ransomware training, basic privacy training, that there are advanced topics that you may want. We've scratched the surface here in the time that's been allotted to us. There's a lot more and a lot of really good information and training that you can do, as Dan mentioned, to make sure that your organization has a culture of security. So we put some things up here to get your juices flowing so that you can start to think about these types of things. We are happy if you're looking for recommendations or teams to help you put this together. We're going to share our information here with you, so feel free to contact us. Let us know if you have other questions or ways that we can be helpful to you and your organizations, or to you individually if you've got more questions or more, you want to take this further. Dan and Mark, any final words before I'm looking at our time here before we quit?
None for me. Just a big thank you for letting us come and present. Really enjoyed the process and getting to speak to a new group of folks around the world. Feel free to touch base with us in the future. We always like to make friends wherever they happen to be, especially those who are willing to work on and continue to work on security.
Yep, absolutely. It was a pleasure, and appreciate the opportunity this evening here. And we definitely look forward to future questions and future opportunities.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you for all the information, the experiences, the tips and the tricks. It was really, really helpful. And I hope that everybody that was present here with us today enjoyed the webinar and learned something. And if you weren't here, or if you know somebody that couldn't make it tonight, we will be posting the webinar recording to our YouTube channel tomorrow. Everybody that registered for the webinar will receive the link, but as always, feel free to share with your peers. We will also share it on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages, and we hope to continue seeing you in our next webinars. Follow us on our social media to stay up to date on everything that's coming up. Thank you again, Steve, Mark, and Dan. That was really insightful, and we hope you all have a great night and see you sometime. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I will end the webinar and we will talk soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great night.